What happens when a 23-year-old heir to a massive petroleum empire walks into a courtroom treating the law as an inconvenience and public property as his personal playground? Blake Hartwell, third-generation scion of the Hartwell Petroleum dynasty, strolled into Judge Frank Caprio's courthouse on a Wednesday afternoon as if he owned the place. On the phone, he was negotiating multi-million-dollar oil contracts, ignoring the bailiff's polite but firm requests to end the call. His custom Italian shoes clicked against the polished courtroom floor, a soundtrack of entitlement echoing in the silent gallery. This wasn't Blake's first encounter with the law, far from it. Over the past 2 years, he had made 13 prior appearances, each resolved quietly behind the scenes, with family lawyers shielding him from consequences. Today, however, the stakes were different. Judge Caprio, with decades of wisdom observing human behavior under pressure, could see immediately that Blake's disregard wasn't just for the court, it was for responsibility ethics and the environment itself. The case on the docket seemed almost absurd at first. The young heir had poured several gallons of used motor oil into the courthouse fountain, dismissing environmental laws as overblown and activist nonsense. But as the courtroom quieted and the evidence began to unfold, the absurdity revealed a deeper truth about privilege, accountability, and the consequences of thinking one is above the law. The gallery of onlookers, environmental activists, and journalists held their breath, sensing that today's proceedings would be a test not only of legal authority, but of moral responsibility. Before we dive into Blake Hartwell's shocking courtroom saga, take a moment. If you believe that protecting our environment, honoring public spaces, and holding the powerful accountable matters, hit that subscribe button. This is more than a legal case. It's a lesson in responsibility that every viewer needs to witness. The courtroom was already tense when Blake Hartwell finally hung up his phone, brushing off the bailiff's warnings with a casual shrug. "Family business waits for nobody," he said, almost as if the courthouse itself was merely a minor distraction in his day. Yet today, Judge Frank Caprio's calm gaze cut through Blake's entitlement with the quiet authority that comes from decades on the bench. The young heir was facing charges that on paper sounded absurd: illegal dumping, environmental contamination, and destruction of public property. But the reality behind the paperwork was anything but trivial. 3 days earlier, Blake had pulled his luxury SUV up to the historic courthouse fountain and poured several gallons of used motor oil directly into the water. He had laughed, claiming he was performing a public service and helping maintain the stonework. The fountain, after all, wasn't drinking water, he reasoned. A few dead fish didn't matter. And why not apply the same industrial techniques his family used on multi-million-barrel oil operations to public infrastructure? In Blake's world, expertise and wealth provided immunity from consequences. As Judge Caprio reviewed the evidence, the courtroom murmured in disbelief. Security footage played, showing Blake unloading dark containers from the trunk, watching the oil spread across the fountain's surface like a toxic rainbow. The ornate stonework shimmered under a coat of petroleum, and a few fish flailed helplessly, victims of the young man's casual negligence. Activists in the front row gasped audibly. One woman shook her head, muttering in disbelief at what she had just witnessed. Blake, meanwhile, maintained an air of unshakable confidence. "The fountain looked like it could use some cleaning anyway," he said. "I thought I was doing a public service." Judge Caprio's patience, legendary though it was, would soon be tested. The judge leaned forward, voice steady but firm. "Mr. Hartwell, are you telling this court that you intentionally poured petroleum into a public fountain?" "Not industrial waste," Blake replied casually. "Just used motor oil from my Maserati, 5 or 6 gallons at most, and the fountain water was just recycling anyway." The sheer audacity of minimizing environmental damage by comparing it to natural processes left the courtroom in stunned silence. Judge Caprio methodically outlined the consequences. "Motor oil is toxic to wildlife, contaminates water systems, and requires specialized cleanup. The $37,000 cost to remove the contamination, the weeks-long closure of the fountain, the potential long-term harm to downstream ecosystems, all of it was a direct result of Blake's careless actions. And yet Blake waved it off, blaming overpriced contractors and claiming that his family's environmental consultants could have done the work for a fraction of the cost. In this opening segment, the audience in the courtroom began to grasp the magnitude of the problem. This wasn't just a case of spoiled privilege. It was a case study in environmental negligence, arrogance, and moral blindness, the perfect storm to challenge both Judge Caprio's patience and Blake's understanding of accountability. Blake Hartwell's casual dismissal of environmental responsibility quickly escalated tensions in Judge Caprio's courtroom. As the evidence was presented, it became clear that the young heir's actions went far beyond thoughtless negligence. They constituted a deliberate disregard for the law, public property, and the delicate urban ecosystem he had so carelessly contaminated. Dr. Sarah Martinez, an environmental scientist with decades of field experience, approached the witness stand. Her presence brought a new weight to the proceedings. "Your Honor," she began holding up a jar of blackened water collected from the fountain. "The contamination levels here exceed EPA safety standards by a factor of 43. 17 fish, 3 box turtles, and countless invertebrates perished. The oil penetrated the historic limestone foundation, requiring specialized chemical extraction that unfortunately caused damage to stonework, dating back to 1887. Blake, with the same unshakable confidence, waved his hand dismissively. "Those compounds occur naturally in groundwater anyway. Everything dies." "Eventually," he said, treating chemical carcinogens as abstract statistics rather than a tangible threat to living creatures. His attempt to minimize environmental harm drew audible gasps from the gallery and frustrated groans from the activist observers. Judge Caprio raised a hand, firmly interrupting him. "Mr. Hartwell, you will not interrupt this expert witness. Dr. Martinez, please continue." Dr. Martinez continued detailing how the oil had flowed through municipal storm drains into the Providence River, contaminating sediment over 2 miles downstream. Her testimony was precise, scientific, and sobering, highlighting the cascading impact of Blake's thoughtless actions on aquatic life, local vegetation, and water quality. Yet Blake remained unconvinced. "From an engineering perspective, the dispersion rate is impressive," he quipped, as if turning widespread pollution into a technical achievement. The courtroom fell silent in disbelief. The gallery could scarcely believe that a man so young, privileged, and educated could so casually rationalize environmental destruction. Judge Caprio, reading the courtroom and sensing the moral disconnect, understood that traditional penalties alone would not teach Blake the gravity of his actions. Fines and restitution could be paid, excuses could be made, but none would bridge the gap between Blake's arrogance and true environmental accountability. The courtroom was witnessing a clash between wealth-enabled entitlement and the uncompromising ethics of public stewardship. As Blake attempted to justify the oil dumping as a protective treatment for the fountain stone, Judge Caprio's measured authority began to chart a new path. It was clear this young man needed to confront the consequences of his own actions, physically and intellectually, if he was ever to understand what responsibility truly meant. The stage was now set for the dramatic turning point where the courtroom would transform from a theater of arrogance and dismissal into a place of education, accountability, and the first steps toward personal and environmental redemption. Judge Caprio paused, letting the weight of Dr. Martinez's testimony settle over the courtroom. Blake Hartwell, still seated, seemed bemused, as though the concept of real consequences had finally reached the edges of his awareness, but only barely. Then, in a moment that shifted the energy of the room, the judge leaned forward and spoke with deliberate calm. "Mr. Hartwell, you have caused significant environmental damage while showing no understanding of the impact of your actions on public resources, wildlife, and the community. Standard fines will not suffice. You will personally make amends." The gallery collectively gasped. Blake blinked, incredulous. "Wait," manually he asked. "Your Honor, my time is worth considerably more than manual labor. I have executive responsibilities, board meetings." Judge Caprio raised a hand, halting Blake mid-sentence. "Your executive responsibilities didn't prevent you from creating this environmental disaster. Board meetings didn't teach you to respect public resources. Today, you will learn what environmental stewardship truly requires: hands-on personal accountability." Blake's disbelief rippled through the courtroom. No family lawyers, No monetary donations, no outsourced contractors. This was direct action, and it was all on him. He would scrub every stone of the fountain, remove petroleum residue from storm drains, and replant and care for vegetation damaged by runoff. Every weekend for 6 months, he would participate in environmental volunteer programs, beach cleanups, river restorations, pollution, monitoring, learning the work and commitment that environmental protection demands. Judge Caprio continued detailing the structured plan. Daily logs documenting progress before and after photos, weekly reports to environmental monitoring specialists, and reflective essays on the connection between human action and ecosystem health. Blake attempted one last escape, suggesting his family foundation could fund habitat restoration instead. The judge's response was firm and unwavering. "Mr. Hartwell, your family's wealth created the attitude that led to this offense. Writing checks will not teach you to respect public resources. Only direct personal restoration work will." The courtroom was silent except for the sound of Blake's shallow breaths. For the first time, the luxury privilege and entitlement that had insulated him from consequences were stripped away. He was no longer an untouchable heir. He was a man confronted with the tangible results of his actions. This turning point, forcing Blake to personally experience the consequences of his environmental recklessness, transformed the case from a simple legal proceeding into a moral lesson. It illustrated Judge Caprio's belief that true justice often extends beyond punishment. It requires education, engagement, and the opportunity for genuine transformation. The heir who once considered environmental laws a nuisance would now face weeks of hard reflective work, bridging the gap between arrogance and accountability. The courtroom had reached a tense stillness. Every eye was fixed on Judge Caprio as he prepared to deliver the consequences of Blake Hartwell's actions. The young heir, who had so confidently treated environmental law as optional, now faced a reality that no amount of wealth or entitlement could obscure. Judge Caprio's voice, measured but unwavering, filled the space. "Mr. Hartwell, the law and public responsibility cannot be bypassed by privilege. You have endangered wildlife, contaminated public water, and damaged historic property. Today, justice will teach you more than fines ever could." Blake swallowed hard, realizing that the lecture he expected would be replaced by something far more demanding. Judge Caprio outlined the Environmental Accountability Program: 40 hours of manual cleaning of the courthouse fountain, painstaking removal of oil from storm drains, replanting damaged vegetation, and on-site supervision by environmental specialists. The judge stressed that no power equipment contractors or family assistants could be used. Each task would demand Blake's personal effort and full attention. As the sentence unfolded, it became clear that Blake's punishment was as much about education as justice. Every weekend for 6 months, he would join local environmental volunteer programs, learning through hands-on work how pollution spreads, how ecosystems are interconnected, and how human negligence can ripple far beyond immediate perception. Additionally, Blake would document his progress with daily logs, photographs, and weekly reflective essays reviewed by environmental science professors. Blake's protests, claims of executive responsibilities, and the supposed efficiency of financial donations were met with firm reasoning from Judge Caprio. "Your family's wealth allowed you to ignore consequences until now. Writing checks does not teach stewardship. You will learn by repairing the damage yourself." The courtroom, once incredulous at Blake's arrogance, now watched as the gravity of his responsibilities began to sink in. By the end of the session, a profound sense of accountability had been established. Blake had been stripped of privilege in the context of his crime and required to engage directly with the environmental consequences of his actions. Judge Caprio's decision emphasized that true learning and justice are inseparable. It was not enough to punish with money. Transformation demanded personal responsibility, reflection, and tangible restitution. The gallery of onlookers, activists, citizens, and journalists felt a mix of astonishment and satisfaction. This was more than a courtroom ruling. It was a lesson in morality, responsibility, and the real cost of environmental negligence. Blake Hartwell, the privileged heir who once saw the law as a minor inconvenience, was about to confront the full consequences of his actions. Justice had been served not just for the city, but for the lesson it would impart on a young man who had previously believed he was untouchable. 4 months later, Blake Hartwell returned to Judge Caprio's courtroom, but the man who walked through the doors that day was markedly different. Gone were the designer suits, the arrogant air, the casual dismissal of laws and consequences. In their place, Blake wore work clothes moved with careful respect and carried the humility that only hands-on responsibility could teach. The courtroom, once a stage for entitlement and disbelief, now became a space of reflection and redemption. Judge Caprio reviewed the extensive documentation of Blake's environmental restoration work. The fountain was restored to pre-contamination condition. Storm drains were scrubbed free of petroleum residue, and the previously damaged vegetation had recovered. Environmental specialists and volunteer supervisors reported that Blake had not only fulfilled but exceeded expectations, approaching every task with sincerity and attention to detail. The reflective essays he had submitted demonstrated a deepening understanding of the interconnectedness of ecosystems and the human responsibility to protect them. Blake stood to address the court, his voice steady but charged with genuine emotion. "Your Honor," he began, "4 months ago, I saw the environment as something to be used for convenience. Today I understand that every ecosystem is connected, and pollution in one place affects life far downstream. Manual cleanup taught me that restoration requires far more effort than prevention. I've seen what it takes to protect habitats and wildlife, and I've learned that stewardship is a daily responsibility, not a luxury for the wealthy." Judge Caprio nodded with satisfaction. "Mr. Hartwell, you entered this courtroom as someone who treated environmental laws as obstacles to convenience. You leave it as someone who understands the weight of responsibility, the value of public resources, and the importance of personal action in protecting the natural world. Your charges are dismissed not because the law was lenient, but because you have learned what it truly means to be accountable." The courtroom erupted in quiet applause. Admiration mingled with relief. Blake's transformation was complete, not imposed through money or influence, but through labor, reflection, and engagement with the very environment he had once disregarded. This case became a testament to Judge Caprio's philosophy. True, justice educates, restores, and inspires. Before leaving, Judge Caprio addressed the audience directly. Environmental stewardship is not someone else's job. Every action has consequences, and accountability begins with each of us. Whether you're watching this story from home or participating in your local community, remember that protecting natural resources is a responsibility we all share. The message was clear. Real change comes through responsibility and personal involvement. For Blake Hartwell, the courthouse fountain was no longer a symbol of privilege. It became a lesson, a place of redemption, and a starting point for a life dedicated to environmental awareness. Call to action. If this story inspired you, share it with someone who needs to understand the power of accountability. Like, subscribe, and join the conversation about protecting our environment and holding ourselves accountable for the world we leave behind.